On part two of the last call for the neighborhood tavern, I talked to acclaimed beer writer Dave Infante to get his take on tavern culture, the neighborhood taverns. Stay tuned, that's coming up now. Every beer has a story. Some changed history, some disappeared overnight, some changed the way we drink. If you like learning something every time you watch or listen, welcome to Beer in Front. And sometimes the beer in front of you is the best one yet. Welcome to a special part 2 episode of Beer in Front. I'm your host, Dave Zalatoris. Today I talked to Dave Infante. He's a writer from VinePair. You may know him from his independent newsletter, Fingers. You may know him on social media. I sat down and talked to him about the neighborhood tavern culture. We got into all that and much more. I wanted to run it as a separate piece because I thought both shows together would have been too long and no one's going to listen to an hour and a half. People's attention spans aren't that great. So I split it up into 2 episodes. So the interview with Dave is coming up next. Next week on its usual Monday release date, I'll have another episode, a regular episode of Beer in Front. I'm going to change things up with the format, the style. Things have been getting a little stagnant, and maybe some of that's my fault, which possibly could be, but I just want to kind of mix things up. So definitely keep an eye out for that coming out next week, probably Monday morning. Just want to change things up a bit. Like I said, things have been getting stagnant, stale with downloads and listens. So hopefully, we'll try some things, see if it works. And if it doesn't, hey, I could always go back to the 2020 version of Beer in Front where I just sit and call people a jagoff all day, but I don't think that's going to happen. But definitely stay tuned. I'm excited about new things that are going to be coming up starting on Monday. So enough of that. Let's get to the interview with Dave Infante. Whether it's the neighborhood corner tavern that's been pouring beers for generations or the newest beer bar trying to make its mark, taverns have always been more than just places to grab a drink. They're community gathering spots, local landmarks, and increasingly businesses facing a rapidly changing landscape. Today's guest has spent years covering the business of alcohol and the forces shaping the hospitality industry. Dave Infante is an award-winning journalist, contributing editor at VinePair, and author of Fingers, an independent newsletter that digs deep into the economics, policy, and people behind beer and more. His reporting has helped readers better understand everything from brewery trends and distribution to changing consumer habits and the challenges facing bars and taverns across the country. Today, we'll talk about the current state of the American tavern, how changing drinking habits are affecting neighborhood bars, the economic pressures owners are dealing with, and what, if any, gives him optimism for the future of these beloved institutions. Dave, thanks so much for taking time out today.
Dave, thanks so much for having me.
Finally, nice to meet you via virtual Zoom screen here.
Yes, likewise. I hope someday we can share a pint or several in Chicago. But until then, we'll have to stick to Zoom.
Well, it was funny because, you wrote a piece on Fingers right at the time I was getting everything together for this episode. So it was like perfect timing there. When doing your research and looking at the tavern industry today, how would you describe its overall health?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV, but I mean, I think if I had to diagnose, I would say the patient is not doing well, but not terminal, right? I think it really requires a definition of terms to some extent, right? Like, I think there's a category of hospitality that is thriving in the post-pandemic environment. There's a lot of evidence from market researchers and sales figures in the on-premise, and also anecdotally, that there is a demand for on-premise experiences, right? Experience is the big buzzword these days.
Yeah.
But it really is true that there's a cohort in the on-premise that's doing quite well right now. These are, either they can be high dollar, high premium restaurants that are having a lot of success in New York and moving to Miami and moving to San Francisco. I'm thinking specifically of Carbones in this case, but there are others. It can also be like more novelty driven concepts that are oriented around the latest TikTok trends and courting sort of an ephemeral but constantly cycling, new consumer base, right? So like if you're on the TikTok treadmill as a cocktail bartender, as a mixologist, the game is not to necessarily perfect a small, like tightly curated menu of classics or of innovative drinks that you're going to work on night in and night out, but identifying a trend that is either nascent on TikTok or maybe that you feel like have product that you can present to TikTok and it will become trendy, and riding that wave and then finding the next wave to ride. So there's business there. But when we're talking about neighborhood bars or taverns, as you say, some people call them dive bars. I would argue that there are, even there are plenty of variation within those three terms, right? But like let's use tavern as just kind of the catch-all. And this is the know it when you see it kind of corner bar, comfortable, not really trying to heaven forfend, trying to jump on TikTok trends.
Yeah.
Not really interested in that, not really set up to do that. Is really functioning and has functioned as more of a third place for the neighborhood. Those on balance, those bars are not doing very well. The health of that business in the on-premise, and of course, there are variations state to state and even within cities, depending on the neighborhood. But the general rule of thumb here, and these are, kind of the macro, or excuse me, the universal themes that we see and that I see when I'm reporting on this stuff are rents are increasing, right? There was a dip during the pandemic, but then it came roaring back and now commercial rents are increasing. There's a lot of downward pressure on land use, because many cities need more land for housing, which means that in order to make that land valuable for commercial tenants, landlords are either going to charge the tenants more or they're going to sell to a developer that's going to redevelop, for housing or for something else. And to some extent, that's the way land use works in this country. I don't think that's necessarily nefarious. And certainly there's plenty of places that need more housing and whatever, but like that's a factor as well. And then there's also the factor that these bars, and this is a cultural thing, these bars, part of the reason that we love them, and I do love them as a customer, right, as a drinker, is we love them because they're comfortable and because they're reliable and because they feel like home or an extension of home, right? But those themes or those mores are or characteristics are at odds with a mainstream consumer base that has an appetite for novelty and has an appetite for or a thirst, no, to do a pun here, a thirst for new experiences. And the other problem is the reason that we like these bars are because they're cheap, right? Like you can afford to have a few drinks, but that math gets a lot harder to work out because the margins aren't getting any fatter on, selling tall boys of Tecate over the bar, right? Like that's not a high dollar business. And it never has been, to be clear. Like it's always been a volume. You have to, that's why beer is so relatively affordable compared to wine and spirits. But you're seeing slight reductions in the amount people are drinking, really slight. I don't want to overblow that. People will say, oh, no one's drinking. There's not a lot of data for that, right? But like we do see small declines in overall consumption. And that's hitting the bottom, like rung of the ladder, so to speak, the hardest, because, if you're a volume business that sells a lot of cheap product and you're selling less cheap product, like, and the rent's going up, like it's hard to pencil that out.
I did a piece a couple months ago on GLP-1 drugs and places
Sure.
that rely on volume. If a lot of customers can't do volume, they could only have maybe one, and their stomach's telling them no. I think that's another reason why places like this are starting to decline a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I do think that there's something there, right? I don't want to dismiss it. I just filed a column. We're recording this on a Friday. I filed a column this past Wednesday, that was titled "Booze Execs Are Running Out of Excuses," and I was making the point that like there are traditionally over the course of the past like decade or so, there's been this received wisdom, right? And like in the upper echelons of the beverage alcohol industry, I'm really talking more about the corporate sector, right? Not the mom and pop craft breweries or craft distilleries, or whatever. But the received wisdom in this rarefied air is that there are some real alligators close to the boat. One is this idea that that Gen Z isn't drinking, right? Like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Like Gen Z is just not drinking, yada, yada, yada. The second is neo-prohibitionism. There's this shadowy cabal of scientists, these supposed white hats that are aligned with the World Health Organization that are scheming in the background and just waiting for an opportunity to do temperance 2.0. And then there's weed, right? That was the third one, right? Is that what's going to happen with cannabis once federal legalization of recreational cannabis happens, our business will be decimated. We're totally doomed, right? And THC has certainly fueled that fire since the 2018 Farm Bill, which opened this loophole to allow for Delta 9 THC products to be marketed. That's certainly stirred up more of that anxiety. And then the fourth, and this is the newest one, right? This excuse, so to speak, has only been available for a few years because the drug has only been available for a few, is GLP-1s, like the Ozempics and the Wegovy's and of those four, I've been reporting on this for about, 16 years. I am most persuaded that GLP-1s present the biggest, sea change threat to the drinking industry, to the hospitality business that relies on the attractive margins of alcohol to make the whole thing work, to the alcohol suppliers themselves that that's the product they sell, and they need to sell a certain amount of it to make their payroll and generate their profits and return that to shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. Ozempic et al. Is what I think is, I don't think it's the death knell for the industry, but I am much more persuaded that there's a serious adaptation, that it will trigger and demand serious adaptation from the alcohol business than any of the others. There's just not a lot of evidence borne out for the other three. Just this past week, IWSR, which is a major market research firm that covers the beverage alcohol business pretty closely. It's well respected. It's been around for many, many. They put out their mid-year report. It's called BevTrack. They do it twice a year, and their finding was that there is just no evidence that Zoomers aren't drinking at rates that we would expect them to, right? Like they're a smaller population, right? There's less of them generally, but per person as a cohort, it's about exactly what you would expect. Their finding was even more troubling was that boomers, older drinkers, who throughout their lives had really drank like fish, right? Like these are heavy users, so to speak, as the trade would call them behind closed doors. But these former heavy users that are now, the youngest boomer is teetering on the verge of retirement age right now, but most of them are retired. They are just drinking way, way less than you would expect them to at this age. So their drinking has been disproportionately down, whereas Zoomers have been more or less proportional. And that really took the air out of that excuse that well, we can't do anything about sales. Like Zoomers just aren't drinking, right? Like that. I think that was a definitive debunking of that. But yeah, your point about GLP-1s is well made and well taken. I think that's a meaningful change. Everything indicates that it will continue to be a meaningful change once it becomes a pill form. The injection obviously still makes it relatively low adoption, but once that's a prescribed over-the-counter pill, or not over the counter, but a prescription pill, that's going to be much more widely available. And barring, we don't know the long-term effects of these things. So there's still a potential situation where 5 years from now, we find out, oh my God, like this has terrible midterm to long-term side effects. Everyone freaks out and stops using it, right? That's possible. It really is. Like we just don't know enough about these drugs. And I'm not a medical professional, but the literature that I read has basically everyone saying the same thing, which is it's working in the short term, but we've got to have longitudinal studies to really know whether this is worth it, quote unquote. Assuming that it is, then yeah, I do think it will reshape the alcohol business to some extent. To what extent though, Dave? Are we talking about a couple points on the margin here? maybe a little bit more than that. Are we talking about 50% of like drinkers just stop drinking? I don't That's not plausible to me, right? I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And so yeah, I mean, I do think that that affects the on-premise for sure because I mean, and your listeners know, and anyone in the hospitality business knows, alcohol is a very important, component of your overall blended margin. It offers attractive margins compared to like a basket of French fries, man. Like you can't sell a basket of French fries at the same profit as you can sell a beer, and certainly as you can sell a pour of bourbon or a nice Bordeaux.
Well, going back to like the neighborhood tavern, back in the day, what role did that corner bar, the neighborhood tavern, saloon, whatever we want to call it, play in like the immigrant and the working class neighborhoods that it really didn't play anywhere else?
Yeah, so there's a few, it depends on how far back you go, right? But like if you go to pre-prohibition, like the saloon had a very negative overall connotation in terms of its civic hygiene, right? Like this was a dark place with no windows. This was a place where gambling occurred. This was a place where the man of the house would, leave the factory with his paycheck in his pocket and come home, 9 drinks later with a black eye because he got in a bar fight and no money left, right? And his wife and kids are, she has no money to go buy the kids bread or whatever the next morning. I'm editorializing here, but there was certainly a negative connotation with saloons, right? And this is in the pre-prohibition era, and this is what gave temperance advocates so much ammunition. Is there was a genuine social they were a genuine social problem, right? Like there were real harms that were being done, and they were being done at a population level. This wasn't just a matter of like, some bad apples type of thing. The system was set up to kind of take these guys' money, get them drunk. There was an enormous amount of corruption where the big suppliers like the Anheuser-Busch's of the world would effectively the saloons would be in hock to the suppliers, right? This is the concept of tied houses. This is part of what the post-prohibition legislature legislation that came in the aftermath of prohibition was trying to guard against, is this massive influence that the liquor interests have over the communities, right? And so I think pre-prohibition available evidence indicates that those were saloons were thought of negatively. Now, there's counterexamples, and it's worth mentioning that there were other models besides the saloon that were being pioneered in growing American cities. I'm thinking specifically of Milwaukee. It was a city that I love drinking in today, right? Like contemporarily. But back then, even pre-prohibition, the German immigrants in Milwaukee had, introduced this concept of like what we now think of as beer gardens. But what we think of as beer gardens now is pales in comparison to the glamour and splendor and investment that the Schlitzes and the Pabsts and the Blatzes of the world were. And not to leave any, there are many more brewers in Milwaukee, but the Millers, whatever, all of them, what the investments that they were making in these, I mean, they were effectively amusement parks. Like they oftentimes would have Ferris wheels, they would have live bands, they would have, produced entertainment for the masses, and you would go and you would drink, your light, Pabst Lager or your Schlitz or whatever, and you would socialize with other German Americans, and you would sing songs, and then you would go home, right? There were counterexamples and more healthy ways, what we would think of now as more healthy ways to have these communal spaces, these third spaces. Like these were subsidized beer gardens, right? The beers were cheap because they wanted you to come in and they wanted you to have fun. There was this vision, and I don't think that these people, the beer barons of the pre-prohibition era were only good-hearted folk. They were also trying to make a profit, and they saw it as good for business, but they did genuinely see it as good for business, that they wanted to build these third spaces to look differently and be sort of community spaces where children and women could be, and it wouldn't be bad. Fast forward to post-prohibition, the emergence of, the modern tavern, right? The untied house, so to speak. After prohibition, they decide, okay, we need to prevent vertical integration here. Then we're going to invent this thing called beer distributors, or, alcohol distributors. And we're going to prevent the big suppliers from controlling the retail, points, so the bars and the restaurants and the groceries, et cetera, et cetera. The evolution of the neighborhood bar, in the post-prohibition era it functions somewhat similar to what we see it, still working as in Great Britain today, which is like it's kind of your meeting house. It's everyone is working within their neighborhood or close to within their neighborhood, so everyone is going to specific bars at the end of the day. This is in cities, obviously. In rural areas, there's a different sort of pattern of folkway or whatever, but and is gathering there. You have it's much brighter, right? Like there's changes to the physical buildings, right? Like they build windows. Like it becomes more of a place that's like acceptable for a woman to be, right? And not totally inappropriate. And this also is somewhat parallel with the assimilation of discrete ethnic groups into something more akin to, sort of like a Italian American contingent or a German American contingent or an Irish American contingent, right? Like it's no longer, well, this is where the Irish hang out, or this is where like the Germans hang out, right? Like there is, again, like it wasn't all hunky dory and there were certainly problems, but like there is a conception of sort of more pluralist, like egalitarian third spaces. And part of that is, driven by or is at least facilitated by neighborhood bars, and it worked. Like again, there were problems certainly, but like everything was much more affordable, and cities were places of just enormous immigrant energy and economic opportunity, and people since time immemorial like to drink in good times and bad, and so these bars played an important role in providing places for the community to gather and to exchange ideas, and to commune with one another.
Yeah, you're talking about the tide houses. I mean, we still have here in Chicago. I even think there's a website that documents all the Schlitz houses that are
Really
still around. And
cool.
there's one, like last week, I had to go back and forth to help my wife out with something. And I would go by this old Schlitz house. It still had the globe on the facade. It was awesome to see.
Yeah, I mean the some of that like ephemera, right? So like the old like Tiffany glass style like lamps and the globes that you see, yeah, all over Chicago with the Schlitz globes. The old style signs, of course, also quite famous. The so like this is a point of interest to me, and I've never really like explored this too much, so I'm kind of just hypothesizing here. But like somewhat famously, in the pre-prohibition era, the Anheuser-Busch company, they made and distributed this like oil painting of Custer's Last Stand, right? And there was like this like grand, huge mural, and they would send it to any of the bars that were aligned with Anheuser-Busch or that they owned or whatever, and so there's these beautiful like paintings, right? And it's just one example of what I think was very common in that era, both pre and post prohibition, but I'm talking about, the early 20th century, right? So the 30s to the 60s or 70s or so, before mass production of like gewgaws and knickknacks fully shifted to Southeast Asia. But there was an enormous amount of craftsmanship that was going into these like promotional items, basically. It's what they are. And we really don't see that anymore. And there's reasons for that, right? Most of them are kind of boring and kind of a bummer, right? Like there's the idea is to maximize shareholder return, so you're not looking to spend as aggressively on promotional items, right? You're trying to cut as many corners as possible. You're also like the nature of promotion has changed, where a lot of it is really more oriented towards media and even social media rather than on trade physical, collateral, right? Like table tents and whatever. Like no, people are still doing that. Certainly, that's a core function of selling in the on premise, but it's not the same, right? It would be, and part of the reason for that, I think, also, or maybe driving some of these shifts, is that like the nature of like corporate leadership in especially in the beer world, but also in the wine and spirits business, has changed dramatically in the second half of the 20th century and certainly in the 21st century. You go from family-owned businesses in many cases. Like the Coors family, owns Coors Brewing right up until I want to say like 2000, maybe mid 90s. They merge or
Yeah.
they tie up with Miller. Anheuser-Busch infamously goes all the way until 2008 and then gets hostily taken over by InBev. Brown-Forman is still controlled by the Brown family to this day, right? And we just earlier this year saw the significance of that when Pernod Ricard tried to pitch them on a merger, and ultimately, and then Sazerac offered to buy them, and ultimately the company decided not to do either of those things, even though it would have represented a boon for the shareholders because it's a publicly traded company. It just happens all the shares are controlled by the Brown family. But like they fought that off because they didn't want that. So anyway, they're kind of an exception to the rule, though. Many of these like family businesses eventually get taken over either by larger conglomerates, right? Like I'm thinking Philip Morris acquires Miller in 1971, 72, whatever, and they launched Miller Lite in 74. Or by other, operators, right? In the case of Pabst, gets taken over by like the corporate raider Paul Kalmanowitz, and he moves it out of Milwaukee. Or they get, Anheuser-Busch got taken over by InBev, and eventually they move it out of, it's still in St. Louis, but the headquarters isn't anymore. I say that to say, like, these are people who these businesses used to be run by people who were of the business, right? Like you're in a brewing family and you start in the trade and you eventually, the Bush family, I don't want to say that they like earned their place, right? They inherited it certainly, but like there was still this idea that they weren't going to do anything else. They were going to work and brews. Whereas and I think some of the pride of that, I mean, I've done a bunch of reporting on Anheuser-Busch distributors. Like they used to send these guys, the distributors who are nominally independent, right? Like they're their own businesses, but they all have incentives to only focus on Anheuser-Busch, and this was especially true in the 90s and the early 2000s. And if they were doing well, it was like manna from heaven, man. Like the Bush family themselves, they would invite them on glamorous trips to the Lake of the Ozarks where they have this beautiful compound and they have all these like, top dollar speedboats and whatever, right? It's the coolest thing in the world. They would send them like full sets of dining service, right? Silver platters and stuff, and it's all engraved with the Anheuser-Busch eagle and whatever. And so I say that, like when you bring up like the ephemera that you see in the pubs, it's like, or in the taverns these days, and wonder why maybe we don't see as much of that, is I think because like that stuff was never going to be a return on investment in the traditional sense, right? Like there's no way that was like a good like value proposition, quote unquote, but they weren't doing it just because it was a good value proposition. They were doing it because they were, they were proud of the business, and the business was the family, and we're not going to send cheap shit out into the market, like that's an embarrassment,
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking like you talking about that, just popped in my head when like Gulf and Western started buying all these companies back in the late 60s, early
Sure.
70s, trying to run Paramount Pictures. Like, what do you know about
Sure.
making movies?
Yeah, RJR Reynolds, I think,
Yeah.
is another great example, right?
Yeah.
Like they own Nabisco, and this was famously chronicled in The Barbarians at the Gate, which fantastic book. But like it kind of was like, okay, man, but like what the fuck is this business now? Like you
Yeah.
guys you have crackers and you also have cigarettes, and like
Yeah.
does that make it? And the culture clash was enormous, right? Like it became undone, it came undone in spectacular fashion. That's why the book is such a bestseller. But similar, the case is also that was the case also to some extent with Philip Morris and with Miller, right? Like the word was, and I obviously wasn't alive for this, but like, and was not reporting on the business at the time. This was about 50 years ago at this point, but Philip Morris had more money than it knew what to do with, right? And so it went looking for adjacent business. And by the way, Anheuser-Busch did this as well in the other direction. They bought a snack company. They had a soda company for a
Oh
while.
yeah, Eagle Snacks. I remember
Yeah,
them pushing
Eagle
those
Snacks,
in like the
exactly.
mid
Yep.
80s. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But Philip Morris goes looking for something to buy. They buy Miller, and they have more money than God. Like I said, they don't even know what to do with it. So they do what you would do if you had so much money. You just start spending it, right? And at the time, Anheuser-Busch had just slain the giant of Schlitz, right? Like Schlitz is really in retreat. it's struggling. It had just gone through an arduous federal probe for corruption. It made some bad adjustments to its recipe and really harmed the product itself. So Anheuser-Busch has emerged as this like kind of superpower number one with no clear rival, and then out of nowhere Miller introduces the original light beer from Miller, right, and I think 74 or so, and Philip Morris sees good early indications on that, so they just start pouring money on it, right, and it works, and they start buying up advertising. Anheuser-Busch never had to compete with even with Schlitz so much for advertising on sporting events or whatever, but here comes Miller with all those buckets of money from the cigarette business and starts buying. And there's this great quote, and you're probably familiar with it, and bet a lot of your listeners are too, where like August Bush III gets asked by I think it was Business Week, a publication that asked him, but they're, hey, this Miller company is coming on strong here. Are you worried? And he says, you can tell Miller to come right along, but tell him to bring lots and lots of money, because he was so proud of, he was like, well, we'll just spend them. We'll match them dollar for dollar, and so, I don't want to be overly romantic about the old way that the beer industry worked. There were certainly bad ways that the beer industry worked, and parts of it were seedy and unseemly and corrupt, and that's a part of its history too, and it shouldn't be whitewashed. I think it is true though that there was more personal like braggadocio and in like personal ego investment from the executives who were running these companies than there is now, because there was nowhere else for them to go. If you get fired as the Anheuser-Busch CEO and you're August Bush III, like you are, you're in disgrace. You're not going to get hired at fucking, like to go run Pepsi or whatever. But that's not the way the executive class of this country or the global executive class works anymore, right? Like, in fact, Heineken just hired someone from the parent company of Peet's Coffee to run Heineken, right? And like, that's insane, but that's the way it works now, is like, well, you'll just find another company that kind of has similar, orientation. The marketing whiz Michelle St. Jacques, who was at Molson Coors until late 2025, she's now running fucking marketing for Mr. Beast's like snack company, Beastables, whatever it's called. Like, that's crazy, right? Like, that's not the way it used to work, man. But so I think like it also it changed the nature of personal commitment and investment to these companies, because you weren't going to move. You're an Anheuser-Busch man, or you were a Miller man, or you were a Brown-Forman man, like that was or a Seagram's man, like that was certainly true of the drinkers, but I think it was not untrue of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, you worked your 20 years, 30 years, got your watch, and then that was it. Yeah, you weren't moving from place to place.
That's right.
Yeah. If you had to bet on what the neighborhood tavern or the bar is going to look like in 20 years, what's your prediction?
I think we're at a crossroads moment, right? Where after the pandemic, we have had 6 years to kind of understand how the market will evolve, now that we're quote unquote in the new normal, right? No one even really says that anymore, because we're past the pandemic, and now the question is like, what does it look like? And I think there's two ways that it could go, and there's one that I hope it goes, and then there's another. I think the glass half empty view here is that these businesses continue their slow decline into obsolescence. I think that's a real possibility. Frankly, I think it might be the more likely possibility, right? Like, these are not, by definition, they're not scale businesses, right? They're neighborhood bars. They operate on slim margins, and they have to, because otherwise they become not neighborhood bars, because fewer people can afford to go to them. And they're at odds to some extent with trends like GLP-1s, where the core product that they rely on for margin is maybe being consumed a little bit less by some people, and in the future. So I think there are real, meaningful, and potentially insuperable headwinds for neighborhood bars. Like, that's a real possibility, and we should name it, because I think, there's no reason in kidding. My vision for this, my half-baked vision as a former English major and someone who now covers the drink space, right? I'm not a policy wonk. I'm not a economist or, a master of the financial universe, so to speak. But to my mind, neighborhood bars ought to be considered a social good, a public good, a social good, not unlike like the library, right? Like the library is a place you go and you commune with people and you discuss books and maybe use the bathroom and you enjoy the air conditioning in the summer, the heat in the winter, and it's a place that anyone can go. There's very little expectation for purchasing anything, right? Like there's nothing for sale in the library. Yeah, I think you can pay for copies, on the Xerox machine or whatever. That's about it. They won't really charge you for much, and that's good. We've decided, and the library as an institution is enormously popular in this country, right? Like it polls well across both political parties. It polls well with young people and old people. It is a extremely successful project of socializing. I believe that there's a path for and should be a path for neighborhood bars to be socialized, right? To be treated as social goods. Now, I don't know exactly how this works, if this is subsidies or if this is grants or if this is some sort of like tax exempt status or whatever the case may be. And administering it would be very challenging, right? Like there's no doubt about that. Like, and there's opportunities for corruption, just like there is like in any other facet of life. But we we have a rich culture of drinking in this country, and we have a rich culture of being among each other in dense cities and sharing ideas and starting businesses and meeting our spouses or our lovers or whatever, and and debating the latest political bullshit, what the mayor did, or arguing about how good the Odyssey was if we just went and saw. You do those things in bars, right? And you do more than that. You do the crossword, or you do your taxes, or you do, you call your mom on Mother's Day outside the bar, whatever the case may be. I think those things are the fabric of a healthy society, and certainly an urban society, right? Like, again, rural is a different environment, although I would argue that plenty of rural communities gather at their local taverns as well. There's just unfortunately a lot more drunk driving at the end of the night.
Yeah.
But transit is a big part of it, right? Like these are the things I believe that we should be investing in, and as a country, as a municipality, as a state, like public transit is important for a variety of reasons. Investment on it is extremely lucrative, right? For like every dollar that a municipality spends on public transit, it gets something crazy back, like $1.86 or more. I forget what the exact return is, but it's a very good return, and this is proven out across all sorts of markets. I think that's also true of bars. I think that you would want to moderate how people drink, right? You would want them to only be drinking low ABV stuff, because we also have to name the fact that some people are drinking less for health reasons, and that health harms coming from alcohol are meaningful and costly, and the state needs to not be in the business of promoting heavy drinking, right? But these places could also always have non-alcoholic options. Like there's a way to skin this cat if there's the political will to do it. I think there should be the political will, because I don't want to be I'm 38 now. I don't want to be 76. Is that double 38? Yeah. And walk through a city and it's fucking, Sweet Green over here and Starbucks over there. And, maybe if you're lucky, like a Buffalo Wild Wings, whatever, like those businesses are fine to some extent. I don't really, with the exception of Starbucks, which is a, world-class union buster. And I hope they cut that out. But in other words, I don't mean to denigrate the idea of chain restaurants. They serve a purpose, but I I do denigrate the idea that there would be a city. I don't want to be in a city where independent places to drink are no longer, right? And I think we're headed in that direction. And for every one that goes out of business, there's much rending of garments and gnashing of teeth on social media. I can't believe it. And, like I loved this place and whatever. Something similar happened when Anchor Brewing closed in 2023. Like there was all these recriminations, right? I can't believe Sapporo did it. And I think the bulk of the evidence is that Sapporo really mismanaged that place. But it's not untrue that people were buying Anchor beer less than they used to. And the gap between what the business needed to be, right, and what the revenues were, whether that was enough to close it, that's a different issue. But the fact of the matter is, like, it was not selling as much as it had been in the past. And And yet it had an enormous cultural role in how people understood themselves as San Franciscans or as beer uh, enthusiasts or as, you know, hobbyists of American heritage or history or whatever. Like there, it had all these cultural touch points. It was so important to so many people. And the delta between like what it was as a beer brewery and what it was as a cultural institution, I think it cannot be, you cannot close that gap. You cannot synthesize that delta. The market can't do that for you, right? Like the market is not going to, what the market is going to do is run Anchor out of business and sell it for condos. Or if you get really fucking lucky, Mr. Chobani comes along and
Yeah,
buys
the
it,
yogurt
right?
man.
Right. And that was about as good of a possible outcome as could have happened. But more likely, right, like these august old institutions that no longer can compete in the marketplace, they have unceremonious ends, right? And we deserve more dignified relationship to our cultural history. I believe we deserve to have places that we can go, and maybe we're not drinking as much as we used to, or maybe we never were drinking, but these are important places in our cities and in our lives to be among one another and to socialize with one another. This is the concept of third places, and I reject the notion that the market can deliver these goods as consistently, or the market is the only way to deliver these goods, because in many cases the market is actually taking these goods from us, right? And so I think a different paradigm is necessary, or at the very least worth considering, when we think about how we want our cities to look and how we want to live, our lives of scant leisure that we have.
I'm lucky here in Chicago. I mean, outside of your fast food places, which are different, I think there's only one chain restaurant in the city. That's one
Sure.
little Olive Garden. That's the one thing I like, that I don't have to go to Olive Garden. I could go to my neighborhood Italian spot right down the street. We don't have all of this chain shit everywhere. I mean, yeah, fast food places, pizza places, those are different, but regular restaurants, you don't have Longhorn or whatever the fuck it's called, steakhouses on every corner.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I think that's right. And like again, like there's a place for that, and if people want it, like more power to them, I suppose. Like I don't really like care to litigate it at the level of taste, but I do think it's really important to recognize that like no one is, or not no one, but very few people are starting neighborhood bars in 2026, right? It's a really tough business model, and it's especially tough if it hasn't already been going for a long time. And there's always plenty of investor capital to launch like another fucking Olive Garden, or to resurrect Red Lobster from the scrap heap and bring back endless shrimp, right? Like they have no want for access to capital, whereas like the guy or the woman who's been running like the third generation like neighborhood bar down the street or tavern down the street, they can't get fucking access to capital like that, man. Like they're not liquid. Like they can't like line up, institutional investors, right? And like to the point, like they don't want to, and I wouldn't want them to either. But my point is like these are not level playing field, and the more that you allow, the market to be the only arbiter of how we value these places, the more that you are going to revert to the mean of commodity, whether that's in the product itself, like the commodity beer, wine, or spirits, or the place that you go to buy the product. Where we're talking about restaurants and bars, like like there's always going to be a well capitalized chain restaurant that is ready and waiting to open in the husk of your former local bar, and that the answer is not just go drink more, right? I don't think I think that's a dead end. I don't think that's a compelling answer. So what are some other answers that we could explore? And I do think that it is worth exploring what public-private partnership or public subsidy of these beloved taverns, these beloved neighborhood bars, what that would look like, and how it would work. And so that's what I tried to do in that column I did the other day.
Well, let me get you out of here on this. So you spent a shit ton of time covering beer and alcohol. If you had a free afternoon and you could spend it in any tavern in America, where are you sitting down and what are you drinking?
Oh man, this is such a good question. What a hard question, also. All right, I think because Milwaukee is on my mind, I think I have to give it up to Milwaukee. I went to Milwaukee for the first time, like 6 years ago, and 4 or 5 years ago at this point, and just fell in love with the place. It's such a beautiful place. It's such an amazing drinking town. It has incredible history, and I went to Bernhardt's, which is a corner bar over in, I want to say, like, what is the name of the neighborhood? Bayview. Yeah, it's an amazing bar. It's kind of just your classic corner bar. There's not a lot to it. And if I'm able to drink anything, gosh, I don't know. I mean, I'm in Milwaukee. I guess maybe I would probably drink a Pabst, right? Like a long neck Pabst out of the brown bottle. It has Bernhardt's has a tremendous selection, and they do beer, wine, and spirits. But if I had to pick one, I think I would do that.
Yeah, you're at a place like that, you got to do like old style. You got to do old man beer. I mean, you
Yeah,
have to. You just have to.
yeah, that's right, that's right. Oh man, I haven't been to Bernhardt's in a minute. Yeah, the place is great, and they're just so cool.
You can find them on VinePair. You have Fingers. Where else can people find you at, Dave?
Yeah, so the newsletter's fingers.email is the URL, and then I'm also on Blue Sky. You can find me at dinfante.com on Blue Sky. Fingers is on Instagram at it's.fingers. So that's kind of the social media channels. But yeah, I publish a weekly column at VinePair called Hop Take, and that's about the beer industry, and it comes out on Fridays and is free, so you'll see it there as well.
Got it. Well, Dave, I appreciate it, brother. Thank you so much for taking time out. And we'll definitely, it's only a 90-minute drive for me. I can meet you up in Milwaukee anytime and grab a PBR.
That sounds pretty good, man. I look forward to it.
All right, that's going to wrap things up for this edition of Beer in Front, Part 2 of the last call for the Neighborhood Tavern. I thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/beerinfront. Thank you for listening. Thanks again to Dave Infante for coming on and talking about the Tavern. Have a great week. I'll see you in a couple days. I'll see you on Monday. Have a great week, and remember, sometimes the beer in front of you is the best one yet.